In the northern Indian state of Haryana, in a quiet farming town called Rakhigarhi, there is a burial ground resting beneath what was once one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on Earth. Today, the landscape appears almost ordinary. Endless fields stretch toward the horizon, interrupted only by scattered earthen mounds and dusty village roads. Farmers work the land as generations before them have done, with little to suggest that beneath their feet lies the remains of a civilization that flourished thousands of years before the rise of ancient Greece, before the Roman Empire, and even before many of Egypt's greatest monuments had reached the height of their glory. To a casual visitor, there is nothing extraordinary about the place, but archaeologists know that appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes the quietest landscapes conceal the greatest stories. 5,000 years ago, this was Rakhigarhi, one of the principal cities of the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization. At its peak, this civilization stretched across nearly 1 million square kilometers, covering parts of present-day India and Pakistan. It occupied more territory than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, making it one of the largest urban civilizations of the Bronze Age. Its cities were astonishingly advanced. Streets followed carefully planned grids. Sophisticated drainage systems carried wastewater beneath. Neighborhoods. Homes were constructed with standardized baked bricks produced to remarkably consistent dimensions across hundreds of miles. Merchants traded precious stones, metals, pottery, and textiles across enormous distances, establishing commercial links that reached as far as Mesopotamia. Standardized weights ensured fair trade, while artisans produced intricate jewelry, finely carved seals, and beautifully crafted ceramics that continue to impress archaeologists today. Yet despite all of these remarkable achievements, one mystery has continued to frustrate scholars for more than a century. The people of the Indus Valley left behind thousands of inscribed seals and tablets, bearing a writing system that has never been conclusively deciphered. Unlike the hieroglyphs of Egypt or the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, the symbols of the Indus script remain silent. Without readable historical records, historians have been forced to reconstruct the civilization almost entirely through archaeology, studying buildings, artifacts, trade networks, and burial practices in an effort to understand who these people were and where they came from. Then one remarkable discovery changed the investigation forever. Buried beneath the ancient city for nearly 5,000 years was the skeleton of a woman whose grave appeared, at first glance, no different from many others uncovered during excavations. She was carefully laid to rest according to the burial traditions of her community, preserved beneath layers of earth that shielded her remains from the passage of time. For decades, scientists hoped ancient DNA could finally answer questions that archaeology alone could not. But South Asia's climate presents an enormous challenge. Heat, humidity, seasonal rainfall, and naturally, acidic soils rapidly destroy fragile genetic material. Again and again, attempts to recover ancient DNA from Harappan skeletons ended in disappointment. Samples degraded, genetic sequences fragmented beyond recognition. The answers researchers sought remained locked away. Finally, after years of painstaking work and remarkable advances in ancient DNA technology, researchers succeeded in extracting usable genetic material from this single individual. Her bones accomplished something that no pottery fragment, no seal impression, no undeciphered inscription, and no architectural discovery had ever been able to achieve. They spoke, not through language, but through the biological record preserved within her DNA. What emerged from that genetic analysis transformed the study of South Asian prehistory. Her genome provided the first direct genetic window into one of the world's earliest urban civilizations, challenging long-standing assumptions about migration, ancestry, and the origins of the people who built the Indus Valley civilization. Rather than confirming several popular theories that had circulated for decades, the evidence revealed a far more complex story of ancient populations, deep ancestry, and human diversity. It illuminated the existence of a previously invisible branch of human history, not a lost species or mysterious civilization, but a genetic lineage that had remained hidden simply because no one had ever been able to read its biological record before. In that moment, after 5,000 years of silence, one ancient woman became one of the most important witnesses to humanity's forgotten past. This isn't speculation or fringe theory circulating on the internet. It's a peer-reviewed scientific result, published in 2019 in the journal Cell, the product of a punishing multi-year effort by a team of archaeologists and geneticists spanning India, the United States, and beyond. To understand why this single skeleton mattered so much, you have to understand just how badly ancient DNA research had been failing in South Asia up until that point. Ancient DNA survives best in cold, dry places. Siberian permafrost, European caves, the frozen tundra of the Arctic. It is destroyed almost immediately by heat and humidity, and South Asia, with its brutal subtropical climate, monsoon seasons, and centuries of microbial activity working on buried remains, is about as hostile an environment for DNA preservation as exists anywhere on the planet. For years, this meant that the genetic history of one of the most populous and diverse regions on Earth, home today to nearly 2 billion people, was essentially a black box. Scientists could sequence the DNA of ancient Europeans, ancient Siberians, even ancient Africans in cooler pockets of that continent. But the deep genetic roots of South Asia remained almost entirely unknown, hidden behind a wall of tropical decay that ancient DNA simply could not survive. The team that took on this challenge was led by archaeologist Vasant Shinde of the Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute in Pune, who had spent years excavating at Rakhigarhi, and geneticists including Vakish Narasimhan, Niraj Rai, and David Reich, whose laboratory at Harvard Medical School has become one of the most influential engines of ancient DNA research anywhere in the world. Between 2013 and 2016, researchers collected bone powder from 61 separate skeletons unearthed at the Rakhigarhi cemetery. 60 of them yielded nothing usable. The DNA had simply been cooked out of existence by thousands of years of Indian summers. But one sample, taken from the skeletal remains of a woman, buried in the heyday of the Indus Valley civilization, roughly 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, contained a whisper of ancient genetic material. Not much. A vanishingly small amount, so degraded, and so contaminated with modern bacterial DNA that ordinary sequencing methods couldn't make sense of it. The researchers had to build more than 100 separate sequencing libraries from that single fragile sample, each one a fresh attempt to coax out enough authentic ancient signal to be usable, painstakingly filtering out contamination, cross-checking results, and piecing together a genome from what one of the scientists later described as working with genetic material on the very edge of what modern technology could recover. It took years. It was, by the account of the scientists involved, one of the most technically difficult ancient genome reconstructions ever attempted, and it succeeded only because of the sheer scale of the effort and the willingness to fail 60 times before finding the one sample that worked. What her genome revealed, once it was finally readable, immediately reshaped the conversation. This woman, whose mitochondrial DNA placed her in a haplogroup called U2B2, a lineage now essentially extinct in the exact form it existed then, carried an ancestry profile that didn't match any of the migration stories that had dominated South Asian prehistory for decades. She showed no meaningful trace of what geneticists call steppe ancestry, the genetic signature associated with pastoralist populations who swept out of the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas beginning around 4,000 years ago, and who are widely credited with spreading Indo-European languages across huge stretches of Europe and Asia. And she also showed essentially no ancestry from the early farming populations of Iran, the group whose agricultural techniques are often assumed to have spread eastward into South Asia along with the farmers themselves. Instead, her genome resolved into a mixture of two much older components, the larger portion traced to a population of ancient Iranian-related hunter-gatherers, people who lived in that region long before farming was even invented. There, and the remainder traced to something the researchers had never been able to directly sample before at all, a deeply diverged, previously unknown indigenous lineage that geneticists now call the Ancient Ancestral South Indian Population, or AASI for short. This is the part of the story that deserves to be sat with for a moment, because it's genuinely strange when you think about it carefully. The AASI lineage wasn't a population that geneticists discovered sitting in some remote village waiting to be sampled. It was, and largely still is, what researchers call a ghost population, a genetic signature that shows up as a component in the ancestry of living and ancient people without any pure, unmixed representative of it ever having been directly sequenced. Every South Asian alive today, whether in Punjab or Tamil Nadu, whether in Kolkata or Karachi, carries some percentage of AASI ancestry mixed into their genome, layered over by thousands of years of subsequent migration and intermarriage, but nobody had ever found a skeleton, ancient or modern, that represented this lineage in something close to its original, undiluted form. It had always been an inference, a statistical shadow that population geneticists could detect mathematically in modeling, but never actually pin down to a real, physical human being. The Rakhigarhi woman, with her unusually large proportion of this ancestry relative to modern populations, gave scientists their clearest and most direct genetic window yet into a lineage that had been shaping the ancestry of an entire subcontinent invisibly, all while remaining essentially unread and unknown in the scientific record. Where did this AASI lineage actually come from, and how old is it? This is where the story reaches back far beyond the Indus Valley civilization itself, deep into the earliest chapters of the human species leaving Africa. The current genetic modeling places the origins of the AASI lineage at our very early stages of the out-of-Africa expansion, somewhere in the range of 45,000 to 60,000 years ago, when small founding populations of modern humans first pushed east out of Africa, along the southern coastline of Asia, following the coast through Arabia, past the Persian Gulf, and into the Indian subcontinent long before agriculture, long before cities, long before almost anything we would recognize as civilization existed anywhere on Earth. This lineage split off from the broader Eurasian family tree at nearly the same deep branching point that separated the ancestors of East Asians, the ancestors of the Andaman Islanders, and the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of Australia and New Guinea. In other words, the AASI population represents one of the oldest and most fundamental branches in the entire human family tree outside Africa, a lineage that had already been evolving independently in South Asia for tens of thousands of years by the time the Indus Valley civilization's cities were being built, and that had been doing so in almost complete isolation, largely undocumented in any ancient DNA record until this single degraded sample from a woman's skeleton in Haryana finally gave researchers something concrete to work with. The closest living approximation to this ancient lineage today isn't found on the Indian mainland at all. It's found among the Andaman Islanders, particularly the Onge and Jarawa peoples, small indigenous groups who have lived in extreme isolation on islands in the Bay of Bengal for tens of thousands of years, and who share deep ancestral roots with the AASI lineage, even though they aren't its direct descendants and diverged from it a very long time ago. On the mainland, no population today carries anything close to pure AASI ancestry. It has been diluted and mixed by thousands of years of subsequent migration. But some groups carry dramatically more of it than others. Tribal communities in southern India, including the Arula and Pania peoples of the Western Ghats, carry AASI ancestry proportions estimated as high as 70 to 80%, making them, genetically speaking, the closest living relatives on the Indian mainland to the deep lineage first clearly documented through the Rakhigarhi genome. Most other South Asian populations carry somewhere between 20 and 50% AASI ancestry, mixed in varying proportions with ancestry from later arriving groups, and the specific proportion someone carries correlates in a genuinely uncomfortable way with the traditional caste hierarchy in India, with populations historically placed in higher caste categories generally carrying more ancestry from later migrating groups and less from the deep indigenous AASI lineage, a finding with implications that extend well beyond archaeology and into some of the most sensitive corners of modern Indian social and political life. That brings us to why this single skeleton became so explosively controversial the moment it was published, because the implications of the Rakhigarhi genome collided directly with one of the most politically charged debates in South Asian history. For decades, there has been a fierce and often bitter argument over whether Indo-European languages, including Sanskrit and its descendants, arrived in South Asia through a migration of steppe pastoralist populations from Central Asia beginning around 4,000 years ago, or whether these languages originated indigenously within South Asia itself and spread outward, a position sometimes called the out-of-India theory. The stakes of this debate aren't purely academic. They touch questions of national identity, the origins of Vedic culture and the Sanskrit language, and long-running political narratives about who the original inhabitants of India actually were. The Rakhigarhi genome, showing that the people of the Indus Valley civilization at its height carried no steppe ancestry whatsoever, was seized upon almost immediately by different sides of this debate to support completely contradictory conclusions. In a genuinely remarkable turn of events, Vasant Shinde himself, the lead archaeologist on the very study whose data pointed toward a later arrival of steppe ancestry into the subcontinent, publicly endorsed the out of India position at a press conference held the day after the paper's publication, a position that the genetic evidence in his own study did not actually support, and that the paper's other authors and outside geneticists were quick to push back against. The broader genomic data, drawn not just from the Rakhigarhi individual, but from an even larger companion study analyzing 523 ancient individuals across Central and South Asia published simultaneously in the journal Science, actually supports a more nuanced two-wave model. Modern South Asian ancestry formed first from a mixture of these Iranian-related hunter-gatherers and the deep AASI lineage during the era of the Indus Valley civilization, producing the population sometimes called ancestral South Indians, when they later spread southward and mixed further with local hunter-gatherer groups. Then, beginning after the civilization's decline, around 4,000 years ago, waves of steppe pastoralist ancestry arrived from Central Asia and mixed into northern populations, producing what geneticists call ancestral North Indians, whose descendants carry meaningfully more steppe-derived DNA than their southern counterparts do today. This gradual, centuries-long process of mixture, rather than either a single dramatic invasion or a purely indigenous, unchanging population, is what the actual genetic evidence supports, even though it continues to be misrepresented and weaponized in political discourse to this day. There's a broader scientific dimension to this discovery that deserves just as much attention as the political controversy it triggered, and it concerns what this find reveals about the sheer scale of hidden human genetic diversity that has existed and continues to exist beneath the surface of modern populations. The AASI lineage documented through the Rakhigarhi genome is far from an isolated case. In the years surrounding this discovery, geneticists working in other parts of the world have identified strikingly similar phenomena. In 2020, researchers documented what they call a West African ghost population, a genetic lineage that contributes somewhere between 2 and 19% of the ancestry of modern Yoruba and Menda populations in West Africa, detected only through sophisticated statistical modeling of modern genomes, because no ancient skeleton carrying this lineage in isolation has ever actually been found and sequenced. In East Asia, researchers studying the genetic history of the Tibetan Plateau identified a deeply diverged local ghost population contributing a minor but clearly detectable component to modern Tibetan ancestry, distinct from other known ancient lineages, and in 2024, they found a partial physical representative of this lineage in a roughly 7,100 to 100-year-old skeleton from Yunnan province in China. What's striking is that the AASI lineage itself, having branched off so early and so deeply from the rest of the Eurasian family tree, carries a Neanderthal signal that is subtly different in its details from the Neanderthal ancestry found in European or East Asian populations, reflecting the fact that this lineage went its own separate evolutionary way, almost immediately after leaving Africa, and had very limited further contact with the populations to its north and west for tens of thousands of years afterward. In effect, the Rakhigarhi genome captured not just one hidden human lineage, but a genetic time capsule of one of the very earliest splits in the entire modern human family tree outside Africa. A split that occurred so early that its Neanderthal inheritance still carries a faintly distinct signature today, detectable only because modern sequencing technology has become sensitive enough to pick up differences that would have been completely invisible just 15 or 20 years ago. It's worth placing the Rakhigarhi discovery inside the even larger wave of ancient DNA research that has been reshaping the entire field of human population genetics in recent years. The same laboratory network responsible for sequencing the Rakhigarhi genome has been involved in an extraordinary expansion of ancient DNA sampling worldwide. And in the years since 2019, the overall number of published ancient human genomes has grown from a few thousand to many tens of thousands, an explosion of data that has repeatedly forced scientists to abandon simple, tidy narratives about how populations moved and mixed in favor of far messier and more accurate pictures, full of unexpected detours, dead-end lineages, and populations that vanished almost entirely from the surface record, while leaving faint genetic echoes in their descendants. Every time one of these hidden lineages is uncovered, whether it's the AASI ghost population revealed through the Rakhigarhi woman, the West African ghost lineage inferred from modern Yoruba and Menda genomes, or the deeply diverged East, Eurasian ghost ancestry detected on the Tibetan Plateau, the same basic lesson repeats itself. The number of distinct, deeply diverged human lineages that existed and persisted for tens of thousands of years is far larger than any model built before the ancient DNA revolution had ever anticipated, and most of these lineages left no obvious trace in the archaeological or skeletal record at all. They survive only as statistical shadows in the genomes of people alive today, waiting for someone to find the one burial in the one specific set of conditions, where enough of the original genetic material managed to survive long enough to be read. The discovery also forces a reconsideration of how we think about the Indus Valley civilization itself, a society that remains in many ways a genuine historical mystery. Unlike its contemporaries in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no deciphered writing, no king lists, no religious texts we can read, no clear evidence of centralized political authority or monumental palaces built to glorify individual rulers. Thousands of small carved stone seals have survived from its cities, many depicting humped bulls and unicorn-like creatures alongside short strings of symbols that appear to form a genuine writing system. And yet, despite more than a century of attempts by linguists and cryptographers from around the world, nobody has ever definitively deciphered what those symbols mean or even settled with confidence what language or language family they were originally used to record. This is part of why a single strand of ancient DNA carries so much weight in this particular case. where the archaeological and epigraphic record has stayed stubbornly silent for well over 100 years. The genome of one buried woman was able to say something concrete and directly testable about where the people who built these cities actually came from, a kind of evidence this civilization had never previously been able to offer. What it did leave behind was an extraordinary degree of urban planning sophistication, cities with grid layouts, sophisticated drainage and sanitation systems that wouldn't be matched again in that region for thousands of years, standardized systems of weights and measures suggesting extensive and well-regulated trade networks, and evidence of contact stretching as far as Mesopotamia to the west. And yet, for all of that material sophistication, we had, until very recently, known almost nothing about the biological ancestry of the people who actually built and lived in these cities. The Rakhigarhi genome changed that, even working from a sample size of exactly one individual, a limitation the researchers themselves were careful to acknowledge, noting that the Indus Valley civilization likely encompassed considerable genetic diversity across its vast territory, and that this single genome cannot be treated as fully representative of the entire population. But even with that caveat, this one genome, cross-referenced against a companion set of individuals found at sites in Iran and Turkmenistan who shared a similar genetic profile, despite being found outside the Indus Valley's core territory, a group researchers now call the Indus Periphery Cline, confirmed that the ancestry pattern found in the Rakhigarhi woman wasn't a fluke or an outlier. It was representative of a broader population that had spread and traded across a huge swath of Central and South Asia during the height of the Bronze Age, one built from that same deep combination of Iranian-related hunter-gatherer ancestry and the previously invisible AAS lineage. What makes this story worth telling isn't simply the technical achievement of pulling a readable genome out of a single degraded bone sample, remarkable as that achievement was. It's what that genome represents about the limits of what we think we know regarding human history, and how much of it remains hidden not because it didn't happen, but because the physical evidence of it has been erased by time, climate, and geography before anyone had the tools to read it. For decades, the population history of South Asia was constructed almost entirely from indirect evidence: linguistic reconstruction, archaeological pottery styles, comparative mythology, and inference from modern population genetics run backward through statistical models. All of that indirect evidence pointed toward the existence of something like the AASI lineage, an ancient indigenous population that had been in South Asia for an extraordinarily long time before any later migrations arrived. But indirect evidence, no matter how sophisticated the statistical modeling behind it, is not the same thing as an actual physical human being whose bones you can hold and whose genome you can sequence letter by letter. The Rakhigarhi woman gave scientists that physical confirmation, transforming a mathematical ghost into something closer to a documented historical reality. A real person who lived and died in a real city, whose body was buried in a real cemetery, and whose DNA carried within it a lineage stretching back tens of thousands of years to the earliest waves of modern humans who ever set foot in South Asia. She lived through the height of one of the world's first great urban civilizations, was buried in its largest known city, and then lay undisturbed for roughly 5,000 years until a team of archaeologists and geneticists, working against nearly impossible odds imposed by climate and decay, finally coaxed her genetic story back out into the light. That story didn't just tell us who she was. It told us something true about nearly 2 billion people alive today, whose own ancestry, whether they know it or not, still carries an unmistakable trace of the same deep and ancient lineage that first appeared, unrecognized and unread, buried in a single skeleton beneath the fields of Rakhigarhi.